The first book that I finished in this round was Downward to the Earth by Robert Silverberg, and I happen to have this vintage hard copy book club edition with the Frank Frazetta cover. It's one of the big famous Robert Silverbergs and considered one of the best, and I consider it one of the best too out of the books that I've read. I've probably read 8 or 9 Silverbergs at this point, and my favorite is The World Inside, which is not one of his preferred ones typically. And this is the one that has come the closest to unseating that one, in my estimation. It's about a man who was an administrator on a world under this intergalactic colonial power, interstellar, we'll say, colonial power that's analogous to the British Empire, who revisits the planet after it has been ceded back over to the native sentient life forms to self-govern, and him attempting to come to grips with crimes and oversights that he conducted during his time as one of the higher-up administrators on the planet, and attempting to seek forgiveness of the natives. And it's a direct reference to potentially retelling of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which I'm ashamed to admit I have not actually read. So it's one of those two, I'm not sure which, but heavy, heavy parallels drawn between both of them. It's a book that's full of conscience. It's full of emotional detail and character development. Very interesting on every front. The characters are clearly well drawn, well drawn. The aliens themselves, there's some fascinating exobiology that Silverberg puts on display. Highly intelligent, sentient aliens that look like Earth elephants, and another more mysterious race of aliens that look like big baboons with huge claws. It's an adventure story with a lot of very finely drawn character detail and emotional development detail, and if that makes sense. And the ending is explosive and huge, kind of cosmos spanning in its scope, which I always love. That's kind of my favorite science fiction ending. Very moving book, and I really have almost nothing negative to say about it, except that it was a fix-up novel, meaning it was composed of short stories that were edited together into a novel. And you can see the seams a little bit, which is typical of a fix-up. Not as much as something like City by Simak or other famous fix-up novels. But you can kind of see the edges a little bit, and consequently, there's just a tiny bit of padding in it. He kind of takes little detours and luxuriates in the circumstances that the narrative carries him and us to, and kind of lingers just a moment or two too long in places. But it's Silverberg. I mean, it goes with the territory. He has this effect on me that not a lot of other science fiction authors have, where I feel like it was almost effortless. It gives the impression of having been written over the course of maybe a week and kind of one-handed while sipping a bourbon. It just has this casual, easy feeling to it. It's like watching someone who's so good at carpentry, it makes it look effortless, makes you think that you could be a carpenter. It has that kind of a mastery, and it sucks you in, and it just seems to finish itself. That was the case with World Inside. It was the case with this. I think I killed this in 2 sittings. World Inside I read in 1. It just breezes right past you, through you. It's just such an effortless read, but deceptively effortless because it's such a rich story. I think I gave this an 8 out of 10. Now that I'm talking about it, I don't know why I docked it down from a 9. I'm doing these numerical rankings just for the sake of this 100-book challenge, and I'll probably abandon it again after I'm done. The next one I read was A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. I'm slowly churning through my list of shame. This is one of the required science fiction readings that I had not conducted. Now I have conducted it. Sometimes these books live up to the hype, sometimes they don't. This is somewhere in the middle for me. I didn't dislike it at all. I do have a couple of notes of criticism, I guess, of it, or things that prevented me from really falling in love with it. It is definitely a unique science fiction book. It feels, well, it's considered literary science fiction for very good reason. It feels like it's kind of nominally science fiction. You could shelve it either in lit or science fiction. That's not a criticism. It's meditative, thoughtful. It's full of themes and allegory and biblical reference and reference to kind of apocryphal religious stories. It was also a fix-up novel, and it is a little bit uneven. It has some interesting background. Walter M. Miller Jr. died early as he was working on a sequel to this, and he didn't have a big output, certainly not in novel form. This is his one novel, and he did write a lot of short stories. But he was in World War II and participated in the firebombing of a monastery, I think in Italy, which clearly traumatized him, and this is his reflection upon that, trying to come to terms with it. And he was a Catholic in his private life, and it shows through in Canticle for Leibowitz, which is about an order of monks who are preserving documents and artifacts that belonged to an engineer named Leibowitz, who lived in a pre-nuclear apocalypse America. Leibowitz undertook it to attempt to preserve a corpus of science, kind of like the same premise as Foundation, that it would be carried through a dark age and help humanity to regain its footing scientifically when the circumstances were better after the entirety of world governments had been destroyed in nuclear war. The reading experience is pretty uneven. It's interesting and page-turny for the first part of the book, and then it dissipates into something else. There are 3 major acts. The middle act I found, frankly, a little boring. The final act is the most exciting, and actually I think could maybe be read as a standalone. And I know that the primary, most important task of a piece of literature is not to be entertaining, but it must be said that it was somewhat of a chore for me to get through the middle chunk. It has an interesting tone or series of tones. It begins almost as a comedy. It's very wry and ironic. Slowly over the course of the story, it becomes more solemn and more grotesque, more violent, and more depressing as the moral stakes increase and as the themes shift. And I see this, I don't know if it was intended as such, but I almost see it as a counterpoint to Foundation and the philosophical premises of Foundation, of this pro-science, pro-scientism, maybe, kind of a perspective of scientific knowledge is the thing of primary importance driving human affairs, and it must be preserved and protected. And I think the thrust of this book is more that there's a moral legacy or a set of moral concerns that trump technology and science and secular politics in terms of their importance and their the priority that we should accord them. I'm not a believer. I'm not a pat myself on the back kind of an atheist, but those are my values. And so it did kind of make it difficult for me to really resonate with the themes of the book and connect with it. And I don't think that it's a negative that Miller draws certain conclusions, but I didn't personally find it as moving as somebody who might have a more religious sensibility might when they read it. I gave this a 7 out of 10. There's a big asterisk on that, which is it is a really high order piece of science fiction literature. The prose is really quite beautiful in places. And it's one of those books that I have a feeling may end up growing in its curiosity in my memory and growing in my estimation of it. Not that I have a low estimation of it, but this is the kind of book that might linger and pop back up at some point in the future. The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, another required reading book that I had not gotten around to until now. And I was taken a little bit by surprise because it's a little bit more of a venomous piece of satire or string of satires than I was anticipating. It's, again, a fix-up novel. He didn't write it consciously as a novel. In fact, there are a number of people who have leveled that criticism at it as being narratively incoherent because there's not always a direct overlap between the worlds constructed in the story. And the stories, plural. The story overarching, the meta story, is about the colonization of Mars, which essentially looks like an Earth that's populated by a slightly different form of person. The Martians are psychic and possessed of spooky kinds of qualities, and they get driven out as they come into contact with the human race, and as Earth progressively has more and more of a footprint on Mars. It's barely science fiction, which I actually like. I actually respect that about the book. It seems like Bradbury appropriated science fiction tropes to build a fantasy storyline. I would consider this science fantasy in spirit, if not in form. There are a couple of wispinesses that suggest that it might be proper fantasy. Someone who knows more about Bradbury might be able to answer this. I feel like this might be consciously written in the tradition of the planetary romances, where alien planets basically are just Earth. They have breathable air, and all the aliens are people. And there's a very, very, very non-delineated line between science fiction and fantasy. That's the impression that I got from this. Another one, like Canticle for Leibowitz, that I think is literature first and science fiction second. I looked into the history a little bit after I read it, and I was frankly shocked to find that it wasn't actually a scandalous piece of literature or series of stories when it/they were published at the time. The philosophical thrust of the book is pretty harsh and pretty bleak. It's anti-American in a certain sense of Americanism, what Americanism at the time was. It's anti-consumerism. It's certainly anti-colonialist. I have, like I said, a lot of respect for Bradbury, his perspective generally. There are a couple of pieces of satire that don't necessarily work on me. It's this criticism of kind of a buttoned-up post-war greatest generation conservatism that just I don't think really exists that vividly anymore. So it's not a part of my life, so I find it hard to really stoke a fire internally when I read the satire. I also think that the book is quite beautifully written in parts. He has a really interesting style. I saw it described somewhere on the internet as mythopoetic, which is a word that I don't necessarily fully understand, but I think it applies to him. That sounds about right. He writes almost like he's writing children's fables or fairy stories, but with this really melancholic tone, dripping with condemnation and a sense of loss and a sense of futility. Not all the stories are created equally. There's high points and low points. I gave this an 8 out of 10. I would see this as a great first book to hand to somebody who had not read science fiction before. It's almost as soft as science fiction gets. It's literary. There's not a lot that's opaque in the book. He tends to wear his themes and his beliefs on his sleeve as he writes. And it's beautiful and it's well composed without being overly experimental. And we arrive at Past Master by R.A. Lafferty. This is his most famous one. He's not that commonly read. The people who have read him are almost invariably in some kind of a cult around him. He's one of those authors that generates that response. It's definitely going to be either love, hate. I feel both. I feel as an author, as a reading experience, as a piece of science fiction, world building and literary construction, I adore the book. It's one of the finest and strangest books that I've read in the genre. In terms of its philosophical outlook, I definitely hate it, or I will say I definitely don't identify with it. It's, I think, the most right-wing science fiction book that I've read. It's kind of an text, this primordial conservatism, but that did not put me off the book, and it should not put you off the book. I compare him to 3 people. I think you can compare him to so many people. The whole time I was reading it, these references were popping into my head. He's like this mixture of dozens of different genre authors and pieces that I've read before. It's like they're all put in a Vitamix, and it's this weird brown slurry that still tastes delicious. It still tastes like strawberries somehow for some reason. I would compare him most closely, above all, to Cordwainer Smith, also to Gene Wolfe, and also to Franz Kafka. If you can imagine the 3 of them writing, like almost writing a sequel to Bill and Ted almost. If you can imagine what that would be like, you're getting close to past master. But it is a book that defies any kind of a nutshelling or a description. It's completely bizarre. The way that I've talked about Cordwainer Smith, the way that other people talk about Cordwainer Smith, the way Alistair Reynolds, who turned me on to Cordwainer Smith, talked about him, was that the strangeness of the books insulate it against the aging process, that it'll be timeless forever because it's so bizarre. And that's certainly how I felt when I read Nostrelia. I feel like this is way stranger, and it benefits even more from that phenomenon where, even though it was written in 1968, it feels barely aged. It's aged only in its sense of this like anti-communist, anti-Marxist sensibility that it has. Maybe that's the one stamp that time has left on it. Although the right wing is obsessed with these things now again anyway, it's never really stopped being so. So maybe not. It's about a planet called Astrobe in the 2500s that has been colonized by Earth, and the human inhabitants there have socially engineered a kind of earthly utopia of post-scarcity, material abundance, social control, social cohesion. Nobody wants for anything. Everybody has all of their needs met. They live in perfect harmony. And they are policed by a fleet of hunter-killer robots that are like Terminators, who enforce adherence to the golden dream of Astrobe, the utopian vision of Astrobe. And outside of Astrobe, or not Astrobe, but there's I think it's called Cosmopolis. There's the capital city. There's a cluster of cities that fall under this utopian umbrella. And then outside of it, there are these two slums, enormous slums where people live in wild, outstated forms of poverty that are completely disgusting and grotesque in the way that they're described here. Like there's a tower, there's a tower that is covered in a blanket of living rats who scour through the slums and eat thousands of living people every day. And citizens of the utopian side elect to live in those conditions of poverty by their own free will. They are self-exiled there, and it's tearing the planet apart. And there's a governing body of, I guess, wizards. This is another one where the science and the fantasy are totally, I mean, it's a distinction so vague as to almost be non-existent and unimportant. These three men decide to retrieve Thomas More from Earth's past and elect him as a figurehead governor or president to administer over the planet and attempt to use his moral suasion and clarity of vision to save them all from ultimate destruction as they're pulled apart by this tension. Even though the prose is so bizarre and the world building is so eclectic and crazy, the plot itself is fairly rudimentary. It's a basic hero's journey, almost sword and sorcery type of an adventure tale. It almost feels like The Hobbit or something. I know that that's not sword and sorcery, but it's Thomas More with an adventuring party going on a quest to find self-knowledge and discover the truth. The characters can get a little bit confusing. There's a lot of them, and they're not always completely described. The world itself can also be confusing, but it's dizzying in the abundance of small details. It's a new wave book written by a right-wing Catholic in Oklahoma. I think more than any science fiction book that I've read before ever, this is a philosophical SF book. It's a book of ideas. It's an ideological assault upon, specifically, I think, Marxism, utopian leftism. And I share a lot of its reservations. It's kind of the same outlook as you would get from any intelligent conservative when they talk about it, of these enticements of the utopian ideas, and utopian thinking itself poses a potentially extremely dangerous or life-threatening risk to individual people, to society at large, and to the human spirit. These are not frivolous or trivial concerns. It has to be taken seriously, and there is a core of that kind of conservatism that must be respected and must be dealt with. Ultimately, I don't share his conclusions. I think that the extent to which he describes the consequences of any kind of a utopian consideration or contemplation at all is overstated to the point of silliness. But there's a kernel of it that I do take seriously, that I do respect. And there are certain sensibilities that I do share with him. I share his skepticism of technology, for example. Because I am not an arch right-winger, it does detract slightly from my experience of the book, my ability to really fully endorse it. But it is certainly interesting. It's one of the most interesting books that I've read, and I will be reading everything that I find from Lafferty in the future. I think I gave this like an 8 out of... I don't know, the number thing is especially meaningless this go-around. I think it was an 8 out of 10. After Pastmaster, I definitely needed a palate cleanser, so I picked Voyager and Night by C.J. Cherryh, which I actually ordered off of eBay, which I almost never do, because I love the cover so much, and it's so rare to find science fiction alien horror, body horror, a la The Thing, or Society, or Slither, or Alien, and I am just eternally hungry for those kinds of properties. So I just went ahead and ordered it. I was surprised to find it actually bears a much more close resemblance to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison than to any of the titles that I just listed. It's not really an alien body horror book. Oh well. It's still decent. Takes place in her Union Alliance universe. I've not read any of those. I've not read any other Cherryh. This is my first Cherryh book. My understanding is that it's an unusual one for her. It's about space miners who get abducted by this enormous alien ship where they are replicated in virtual form. Their personalities are templated, and then they themselves are duplicated as sort of ghosts. And they all live in this big network, this labyrinth of gross organic tunnels inside of this ship. It's a brother and a sister, and then the sister's husband, and they're all in their early 20s. Voyager and Night really is most of all a character study of those three, digging into their relationships, their driving motivations, and how their motivations come to play, and attempting to resolve the crisis that they're in. Would have made a superb short story. I have a feeling deep down that this lived as a short story in Cherryh's mind first. Maybe even in print. I couldn't find confirmation of this anywhere online. It is too long. It's slightly too long and pretty redundant. The first half of it, absolute page turner, psychological horror, alien horror. It's slim, sleek, concise, and then it enters a period of bloat. It spins out into these recurring spiritual audits of the three principal characters to the detriment of the plot, and you just kind of get the feeling that it's this cud that you're having to chew too many times. And then the ending is really good. There's some big action stuff right at the end. I thought it was decent. I thought it was decent overall. I gave it a 6 out of 10. I'm going to stick to that 6 out of 10. That's the one rating that I'm really confident in this video. Parts of it are 8 out of 10. Parts of it are like 4 out of 10. The aliens themselves are quite compelling and actually reminded me very distinctly of Morning Light Mountain from Pandora's Star. So if you resonate, if you are a fan of those, of that, whatever that happens to be, if you haven't read the book Pandora's Star, then you may really love this one. There actually is a scene at the front of Voyager and Night that is almost beat for beat the same scene as the humans' first contact in Pandora's Star, the horror scene. I'm not even implying that Hamilton ripped off Cherryh. I don't think that's the case. I think it's parallel thinking, but this version's even better. As far as popcorn reading goes, definitely above average, 6 out of 10. I would like to read more Cherryh in the future. I'm thinking the next 5 is actually going to be all fantasy. I'm reading The King of Elfland's Daughter right now, and I feel like I need a little bit of a mini vacation from science fiction. I think I'm going to focus on that for like 5 books and then circle back to science fiction. So it'll be potentially an interesting and welcome change. I will see you then. Probably before then, but also then.